Y'all doing okay today? We get to finish this super exciting chapter. Said no one ever. Before we do this, does anyone have any questions about your lab on Monday? It was our first lab, and y'all left really fast. Is everybody okay with lab? Yeah. If it is in the manual, you got to know it. So anything that is listed in that first lab is you are responsible for either on the quiz or the lab exams, okay? I mentioned to you how your quiz is going to work, right? So the quiz is just, I may put the rat up under the document camera and point to different organs. I may use the torso model up here. I might use myself and point to things. So it's kind of anything that is in that manual is fair game for the quiz. Not next Monday. I won't see you. Oh, I'm going to the beach. I'm going to the hurricane. I'm going to go get rain on. We're not going to see you on Monday, but I will see you for lab the next Monday. Okay? Anybody have any other questions? Everybody do okay with mastering? Your mastering was due Monday night. Everybody able to get in and answer those questions? Did okay? Okay. Did anyone get timed out? Did it take too long? Y'all have plenty of time? Excellent. Okay. All right, so we are going to hopefully finish, or at least get close to finishing chapter 4 today, which is all on, again, it's all on tissues. So remember, our 4 types of tissues are epithelial, and what is epithelial tissue? Where do we find it? Skin, so it's a covering or a lining. So like lining the inside of your mouth, lining the digestive tract. Right, and then we name our epithelial tissue. We give it 2 names. The first name tells you what? It's either simple or stratified. And what's that tell you? See, people don't like this. How many layers are present, right? So the name tells you the layers. And then the second name is, we call it either squamous or cuboidal or columnar. And what does that tell you? The shape of the cell. So the layers and the shape. That's how we give it a name. And I went through a bunch of characteristics about epithelial tissue with you. So remember we talked about how it has a high degree of cellularity, a bunch of cells in there, jam-packed, not a lot of extracellular matrix. It does not have a blood supply, so we say it's avascular, but it does have a lot of nerves in it. How does it get nutrients if it has no blood supply? From the underlying tissues, right, through diffusion. So the nutrients are going to go from an area of high concentration in the underlying tissues to an area of lower concentration into that epithelial tissue. Okay? They're going to diffuse. So the second, and we walked through all the different types of epithelial tissue. I showed you pictures of them. Now the second tissue that we're going to talk about today is connective tissue. What is the function of connective tissue? Yeah, it's exactly what it sounds like it is. It is to connect things together, right? To give support. So we find connective tissue pretty much everywhere in the body. It's all over the place. It is the most abundant tissue that we have in the body because it's doing a really important function, which is connecting and giving support to a lot of our body structures. Now we divide connective tissue up into these 4 classes. Okay, so we have what I call connective tissue proper. So I just write CTP when I write it out. Connective tissue proper, an example would be like tendons and ligaments. Those are composed of connective tissue proper. Okay? It's a really tough connective tissue. Cartilage. Right? Where do we find cartilage? Ears, your nose, at the ends of all of your bones, right? They have cartilage that keeps your bones from wearing down on each other when you bend them. Another type of connective tissue is bone. All right, hopefully you all know where your bones are. And then the last connective tissue is blood. Which of these is not like the others? Yeah, blood, right? If you think about it, you've got connective tissue proper, tendons and ligaments. They're really tough, they're strong. You've got cartilage, which is also really tough. You've got bone, which is super hard. And then you've got blood. Blood is one of the most atypical connective tissues that we have because it is a fluid connective tissue. It is a liquid, so it doesn't really have the properties of the other connective tissues. But some people argue that blood is the best connective tissue in the body. Because if you think about it, the function of connective tissue is to connect, and blood connects everything in your body together. So some people would say it's actually the best connective tissue that we have in the body. So these are all the functions of our connective tissues. Obviously, it is to connect and to give support, but also it is there for protection. So our bone is obviously going to be very protective, right? We have this nice cranial bone that's protecting our brain. We've got our rib cage protecting some vital organs up in here. Fat is a type of connective tissue which is very supportive. It's very protective, right? It cushions and insulates. That's another big function is insulation. Right? Fat helps us insulate our body. Fat is a type of connective tissue. Oops. And the last one is transportation, so moving things. Now the only one of our connective tissues that can move things through the body is going to be blood. So you might be thinking, okay, so if blood is this one that doesn't really match the others, why is it considered a connective tissue? Right? You've got cartilage, you've got tendons and ligaments, you've got bone, and then we got blood. So why is blood part of a connective tissue? Why is it classified that way? That's because all of our connective tissues, they're actually coming from the same embryonic origin. So when a sperm and an egg come together, so here's an egg, and here's a sperm. So when the sperm fertilizes an egg, you get a single cell that has a full complement of chromosomes. It has 46 chromosomes, right? 23 came from the egg, 23 came from the sperm. Right? My husband argues that because our son looks just like me. So my husband's always like, I was there and I helped, but I don't know that he has any of my DNA. He looks just like his mama. But truly, children have half mom, half dad, 46 chromosomes. So we get this one cell with 46 chromosomes. That cell is going to go through mitosis, and it's going to divide, and it's going to create a big ball of cells that all look identical. Okay, now that big ball of cells that all look identical, they're genetically identical, that's a far cry from a baby, right? But as it continues to develop, what we're going to start to see is some changes. And those cells, that big ball of cells, those are called embryonic stem cells. Those can become any kind of cell in the human body. They have a lot of potential. They can become muscle cells, they can become neurons, they can become types of connective tissue, they can become epithelial tissues, so anything in the body. So what we'll see is that as this ball of cells continues to divide and get bigger and bigger, eventually the cells start to differentiate. That means they're going to start to become a type of tissue. And what we'll see is this is the big ball of cells that has started to differentiate, and they've color-coded it in your book. This is a 16-day-old embryo. And again, you know, it doesn't look like a baby. It's a big ball of cells. But what we can see with it being color-coded is that it's got these different layers in it. And this layer that's right here in the middle, that's in red, that is a type of layer called the mesoderm. Okay. I have no idea. Let's just try to... I got here early so that this stinking thing would work today. It never works. Maybe I can take it home and... There we go. Hang it in my house. All right. So it's called mesoderm, and so the type of tissue is called mesenchyme. So all of our connective tissues are going to arise from this middle layer called the mesenchyme. This is why blood is classified as a connective tissue, because it is coming from that mesenchymal layer. Now, just like we talked about with our epithelial tissue, I want to mention a little bit about connective tissue and how it does have some special characteristics that only connective tissue would have. The first one is that it does have varying degrees of vascularity. which means that some connective tissues have a fabulous blood supply and some don't have any blood supply. So what is a connective tissue that has a wonderful blood supply? Think of the ones I just wrote up on the board. Or do any of these do you know of that have a good blood supply? Don't say blood. Blood is blood.
Bone.
Bone. When you break a bone, does it heal? Yep, and it heals pretty quickly, right? Especially when you're a kid. Kids are like rubber. They break bones and usually within 6 weeks they're healed. As you get older, it takes a little bit longer, and obviously if you break a big bone when you're older, it's going to take even longer. But bones heal, and they heal pretty quickly because they have a fabulous blood supply. Has anybody broken a bone before? When you break your bone, I know it hurts like hell, but when you break your bone, what does it start to look like right after you've broken that bone? Blue, sometimes it's bright red, and it starts to swell and get bigger. And the reason, and it'll be hot to the touch, and the reason for that is not only have you broken the bone, but you've broken all the blood vessels when you break that bone, so you're bleeding into that area, which is why a lot of times it'll turn black and blue or get really red and really swollen because of all the blood flow in there. So we know that bone has a fabulous blood supply. What's a connective tissue that has no blood supply at all? Think of the one on the board. Yeah, there. Cartilage, right? Has anybody damaged their cartilage, like the meniscus in the knee? Anybody? Yeah. So what did you have to do? Did they do anything for it? You had a surgery. Yeah. Usually, especially in the knees, that's because your knees take a lot of brunt and force and wear and tear. A lot of times, if you've damaged cartilage, it's not going to replace itself. It's not going to heal itself because you do not have a blood supply. So usually it requires surgery. They actually go in, sometimes, most of the time it's laparoscopically. They can go in and they can't repair it really, but they can kind of shave it down and make it so that it doesn't hurt anymore. Okay, so usually if you damage your cartilage, it's not going to heal very fast because it doesn't have a good blood supply. So our connective tissue varies in terms of blood supply. It's either a fabulous blood supply or no blood supply. Also, we find within our connective tissues, they have a lot of extracellular material. Well, that's weird. There is nothing special about the LL and U. It just changed colors on me. Extracellular material. So this is just everything that's outside of the cells. So this is going to include the liquid stuff that's in the tissue. You've got a lot of fibers in that tissue. It's just everything other than the cells. You got a lot of that in connective tissue. That's actually what's giving connective tissue its certain characteristics. It's, for example, it's the extracellular material that's helping bone be so hard. It's the extracellular material that helps your tendons withstand all the tension that you're putting on them. Now, what we find within our connective tissue is that there are some structural elements to connective tissue. These are three things that we always find when we look at this under the microscope. And the first one is something called ground substance. So this is the substance that sometimes it's liquidy, sometimes it's more stiff, depends on the tissue. But this is the stuff that kind of fills the space between all the cells. Because remember, with connective tissue, it's not a ton of cells. The cells are kind of spread out, and there's a lot of other stuff, extracellular material. We also have, outside of those cells, we'll have fibers. And the fibers vary in their amounts. They also vary in the type and the density that we have. So we have different kinds of fibers. We have collagen, elastic, and reticular fibers that we can find in our tissues. We're going to talk about each of those. Now these two things together, the ground substance and the fibers, these make up the extracellular matrix. So this is the stuff outside the cells. Okay, and then the third thing that we always have in our connective tissue are the cells themselves. Now depending on the tissue, we're going to have different cells. And you can see I've written them all down up here, but we'll talk about those in a minute. But depending on the tissue, the type of cell will be different. This is just a great example that's showing you those three components. So you can see here you've got some cells in that tissue, but you can notice that the cells are kind of spread apart. So they're, unlike epithelial tissue, they're kind of spread apart. And within there, you're going to find a lot of fluid, and then you're going to find some fibers that are kind of running up and down in different directions. Okay.
Will you go back
Yeah.
2 slides from that right there?
This one? Yeah. Did I go too fast? So those are always the 3 things that we're going to find in connective tissue. We've got the extracellular matrix, which is ground substance and fibers, stuff outside the cells, and then we've got our cells. So I'm going to talk about those 3 components. I'll just touch on what they are, because I went over those fast. So the first one I want to mention is the ground substance. The ground substance can be liquidy or stiff, depends on the tissue. Okay? And a lot of times what we say is that ground substance is sort of like a colander or a sieve, and it's letting nutrients get into that tissue, because remember, connective tissue can be very vascular, have a good blood supply, but it also might not have a blood supply at all, like cartilage. In which case, if it has no blood supply, how does it get nutrients? Surrounding tissues, right, through diffusion. The nutrients still have to get there, you still have cells, so if it's a connective tissue without a blood supply, nutrients are going to get through diffusion. So a lot of times this ground substance acts as a sieve or like a colander that the nutrients are able to pass through to get to those cells. Now ground substance is made of what's called an interstitial fluid. This is basically the term interstitial, just means tissue. Another thing that we'll find in our ground substance are something called adhesion proteins. What does the term adhere mean? To adhere to?
Stick.
To stick to. So adhesion proteins are like glue, and they're going to basically help attach the cells to the matrix and keep everything in its place. And then the last thing that we'll find within our ground substance are something called proteoglycans. Proteoglycans, there's no image in your book, so I drew this out. So I'm a fabulous artist. So this is my take on what a proteoglycan might look like. So it's this sort of big molecule. And what we say is that a proteoglycan has these little green things on it. And the green things are called glycosaminoglycans, or GAGs is what we call them for short sometimes. And so a lot of times what we'll find is that a proteoglycan, depending on the number of GAGs that it has, those GAGs are like bottle brushes. They help it trap water. So the more GAGs you have on a proteoglycan, the more water it can trap, and the more liquidy that ground substance is going to be. The less GAGs you have on the proteoglycan, the less water you can trap, and the more stiff the ground substance would be. So what we say is that, like bone, for example, proteoglycans in bone do not have a lot of GAGs, so there's not a lot of water trapped in that matrix in bone. That's what's going to make your bone nice and hard. Okay. Other connective tissues like adipose tissue, fat tissue, it's really soft, right? It's kind of squishy. The proteoglycans in adipose tissue have a lot of GAGs, traps a lot of water. That's why it's really squishy and compressible. Okay. Now another thing that we'll find in our connective tissue, I told you, is also fibers. So we have ground substance, which is kind of the stuff that everything floats in. And we also have fibers. The 3 fibers that we find are collagen, elastic, and reticular fibers. For the most part, under the microscope, when you look at a connective tissue that has collagen fibers, most of the time, there's one exception, but most of the time, those collagen fibers are going to be very thick, and they're usually going to stain pink in color. Okay, so when you see a big band that is thick and pink when you're looking at a tissue under the microscope, you know it's collagen fiber. Collagen fibers are incredibly tough. They provide us with a really high tensile strength. So these are these fibers that cross-link with each other, and you can pull on them and they are not going to come apart. So in fact, they say that collagen fibers are stronger than steel. So if they take a piece of collagen and they take a piece of steel that's the same diameter, a collagen fiber is 1,000 times stronger than steel. And you have these in your body, so they are incredibly tough and provide you with a lot of tensile strength. Elastic fibers, these are like rubber bands. They're sort of these long coiled fibers, and typically under the microscope, these are going to look very thin and very dark. So they're usually like a black or a dark purple or dark blue, so they're really dark in color. So if you see this sort of thin, dark fiber squiggling through on the microscope, you know that it's going to be an elastic fiber. Okay? And again, these are like rubber bands. They have elastin, so it allows for stretch. So the type of cartilage that's in your ear has a lot of elastic fibers. So this is why you're able to kind of move your ear around and it bounces right back. And then the last type of fiber, reticular fibers. These are like collagen fibers. They're tough, but they're a little more delicate than collagen fibers. And I'm not sure that you're going to have to, I think we might have one tissue that you look at in lab that might have those in it, but that's it.
Where would the collagen fibers be found?
So you find collagen fibers all over in connective tissues. One of the ones that's most apparent is when you're looking at your dermis, which is in the skin. You see a lot of collagen fibers. Another place is going to be in your tendons and ligaments, right? If you think about, I have the muscle man in the back, but if you think about like your bicep, right? Your bicep has this tendon that spans through your elbow, and that's a really tough tendon, right? All your tendons are super tough, and they're getting pulled in one direction. So all the collagen fibers in that tendon run in the same direction and provide you with a ton of strength in that direction. Okay? The types of cells that we have in our connective tissue, they are either found as blasts or cysts. If it's called a blast, it means that it's an immature cell. If it has a site at the end of it, it's a mature cell. What's the difference between an immature and a mature cell? The best way that this is just how I think of it, is I remember, my husband and I were married for a long time before we had a child. And I remember, we just waited a long time, and I remember thinking, you know what, we're going to have a kid so that kid might do the laundry and do the dishes and cut the grass. That is not reality, by the way, so if you have not had children, don't think that they're going to start helping around the house the day that they come out, because it's not happening. I'm lucky if I can get him to make his bed and swift at the floor. But what we find is that the immature cells, I think of these as like the kids, the youngins, these are the cells that are actually the workhorses. They're actually building the tissue. So what you get is you get these cells that are immature, the blasts, that literally make the tissue. So if you've got to make your bone, it's the blasts that are making and building the bone. Once it's been built, that blast is done, it's done its job, and it becomes a mature cell called a site. Okay? So the blasts are immature, they do the work, they build the tissue. And then once they're done doing that, they turn into sites, mature cells. So we have different cells depending on the tissue that we're looking at. So fibroblasts or fibrocytes, right? So the immature and the mature form. These are the type of cell that we find in connective tissue proper. These are like tendons and ligaments, fibroblasts and fibrocytes. If we're looking at cartilage, it's chondroblast and chondrocyte. And that should be easy to remember because that prefix chondro means cartilage. So if you look at any type of cartilage, you know the type of cell in that is going to be a chondrocyte or a chondroblast. Osteoblasts and osteocytes, what does osteo mean? Yeah. Ooh. And then the last one, again, blood is the atypical connective tissue, right? It's not like the others, it's liquidy, it doesn't have all the same characteristics. So it also doesn't follow this blast site rule that all of our other connective tissues follow. Blood has, the immature cells are called hematopoietic stem cells. So the term heme means blood. So you heard me mention up here, we talk about a sperm and an egg, a sperm fertilizing an egg, and you get a cell with 46 chromosomes that goes through mitosis and makes this big ball of cells. These are called embryonic stem cells, right? These are the ones that you hear a lot about people talking about wanting to do research with embryonic stem cells. These have a lot of potential. They can become any kind of cell in the human body. Hematopoietic stem cells. Now it still says stem cell on here, but these are not the same thing as embryonic stem cells. Hematopoietic stem cells can become any kind of blood cell. They can become red blood cells, they can become white blood cells, they can become platelets. That's it. They cannot become neurons, they cannot become muscles, they cannot become anything else. So all these can do is become a type of blood cell. And I'm mentioning this, these are the immature forms, right? So they're going to build the blood. They're going to make all the cells that we have in our blood. And once your blood is created, now they turn into blood cells, a mature blood cell, a red blood cell, a white blood cell, or a platelet. Okay? I'm mentioning this because I remember when I was pregnant with my son, I kept getting literature in the mail about saving cord blood. Save your cord blood, and it's super expensive. Has anybody done it? Anybody saved cord blood? If you look into it, it's incredibly expensive. You know, they charge you a fee, an initial fee, and you got to pay a yearly fee to keep it frozen each year. And so I remember getting the literature, and cord blood contains hematopoietic stem cells. That's the type of cells that are in cord blood. And I remember looking at the literature, and it was like, it can be used for all of these conditions. And it was stuff like, you know, if your child severs their spinal cord, or if your child has type 1 diabetes, it can be used to grow a new pancreas. And I was like, no, it can't. And I looked at some of these things, and next to a lot of the list, there were little tiny stars, little asterisks. So I found the asterisk like on the bottom back of the pamphlet, and it said, well, we haven't really shown that it can be used for any of that stuff, but we know it can be used for these other conditions. And the other conditions were all blood conditions, like leukemia, which is cancer of the white blood cells. So any condition that involved blood, you can use your cord blood for. But anything else, you really use these hematopoietic stem cells for. Because again, they can only become a type of blood cell. So I'll mention that. That might be useful for you at some point, help you make a decision if you're ever in that situation. Other cells that we might find within our connective tissues are things like white blood cells, plasma cells, macrophages, and mast cells. What is the function of all of these? What's the function of a white blood cell? Heal, fight infection, get rid of foreign organisms that get in your body. That's the function of all of these. So if you ever are looking at a tissue, or if I ask you a question on a test, and I say, what is the function of a tissue that contains fibroblasts, white blood cells, mast cells, and macrophages? You automatically know, as soon as I start talking about white blood cells, macrophages, mast cells, you know the function of that tissue is going to be protection and immunity, because it has all of those protective cells in it, okay? So I love this. This is from your book. This is actually from the older edition of the book. I like this one the best. And so this is one of the reasons why I give you the large PowerPoint file, because if you just want to print off this one slide and have this one slide, you'll have it. Now I also put in a couple slides, I put in the one that you have in your book. This is just the older version. I just like this one better. It's like a flow chart. This is fabulous to study connective tissues because we got a lot of them that we're going to go through. So I like this because they all start up here, right? This is our mesenchyme. Remember, all 4 of our connective tissue classes develop from mesenchyme. If mesenchymal cells differentiate and become fibroblasts and fibrocytes, you're going to get a connective tissue proper. If they become chondroblasts and chondrocytes, you get cartilage. If they become osteoblasts and osteocytes, you get bone. And if they become those hematopoietic stem cells, you get blood. So this is a great flow chart just to kind of show you how it links together. And then down here, under connective tissue proper, it's showing you here's all the types of connective tissue proper. Under cartilage, here's our 3 types of cartilage. Here's some information about bone. Here's some information about blood. So this is fabulous to study, right? It kind of puts it all together for you in a big picture. So all of our connective tissues that we're going to walk through, they all have cells, living cells in them, and they're all surrounded by this extracellular material. And unlike epithelial tissue, where you can just kind of look at it and be descriptive, like how many layers does it have, what's the shape of the cell, that's the name. That's pretty easy. This is a little bit harder. You really have to pay attention to what you're looking at in these connective tissues under the microscope. So one of the things that I always look at is what type of cell is in that connective tissue. Now you might not be able to tell by looking under the microscope what type of cell it is, that if I tell you on a test what type of tissue has osteoblasts, and I give you more information, you would know that it's bone, right? Or if I said what type of tissue has chondroblasts and a lot of elastic fibers, you're going to come down and look for the answer that has any kind of cartilage in it, because that's going to be the answer, right? Because chondro means cartilage. So a lot of times on the test, if I just give you a little bit of information, you should be able to narrow down what type of tissue you're looking at. The other thing is fiber type. A lot of times the type of fiber you're looking at will tell you a lot. So again, if I say, what kind of tissue has chondroblasts and a lot of elastic fibers, you should know it's a cartilage, and any cartilage with a lot of elastic fibers is probably going to be elastic cartilage, right? So it should be easier if you know the type of cell, type of fiber, and then sometimes the amount of everything. If you got a lot of these fibers and they're jam-packed in there, you know it's a dense connective tissue. If they're spread out, you know it's a loose connective tissue. Okay? So this will tell you a lot about the type of tissue you're looking at. These are all the connective tissues we're about to walk through. Okay, so here's our big long list. So again, we have connective tissue proper, which has the most, and we have cartilage, bone, and blood. So let's roll through these, look at pictures of all of these, and we'll talk about them. So we're going to start with our, I'm going to flip all the lights out. Don't fall asleep. It's riveting material. Don't fall asleep. We're going to start with our connective tissue propers. Okay, this has the most. We're going to start with, we take our connective tissue proper and we divide it up into loose and dense. All that is talking about is how compact everything is in that tissue. So a loose connective tissue proper, one of the very first ones I'm going to show you is areolar connective tissue. I like the name of this because it has air at the beginning, right? Areolar, airy. That's telling you it's a loose connective tissue. It's really spread out. Type of fibers is all three. So you have collagen, elastic, and reticular. It is a connective tissue proper. What type of cells do we find in connective tissue proper? Fibroblasts. So all these connective tissue propers that we're going to walk through have fibroblasts in them. Now, I'm telling you up here that we also find in areolar connective tissue macrophages, mast cells, and white blood cells. So what's the function of this tissue? Yeah. Immunity. Protection from foreign organisms. Now, if that's the function, that means that this is a type of connective tissue proper that we're going to have everywhere in the body. You find areolar connective tissue, so you have, in your skin, you've got 3 layers. The top layer, and then under that is a much thicker layer called the dermis. And within the dermis, you have areolar connective tissue. So all over, just under your epidermis, you've got areolar connective tissue all over in your skin. That makes sense to me because you're going to want a tissue that has a lot of white blood cells, macrophages, mast cells, plasma cells, right at the surface, right at your boundary, protecting your body. Because this is a loose connective tissue, there's a lot of space in the tissue, and that also makes sense to me because white blood cells don't just sit. They actually move and patrol. I show in my AP2 class, I just showed it yesterday, a white blood cell that was hunting down a bacterium. And it's truly like weaving in and out, and it is tracking it down. It's like hide and seek. It's insane. And so you've got to have a lot of fluid space within this connective tissue so your white blood cells can move and hunt down anything that doesn't belong. A lot of times when your areolar tissue gets damaged, it will soak up extra fluid and it'll get swollen. And we call that edema. Now if you've ever cut your skin, and if you get a cut, like I had a little mole removed on my forearm, so they just kind of shaved it off. And what I noticed right away is that not only did it turn red, but the edges got puffy, right? You know right there that that areolar connective tissue was damaged, right? You get a little cut, a lot of times it'll puff up. You know you've damaged that areolar connective tissue. This is what it looks like under the microscope. So this is showing you in your skin where that areolar connective tissue is. So this is underneath the epidermis, this top layer. Here's our areolar tissue, so it's all over the body. And you can look at this, and first of all, you can tell it's a loose connective tissue. There's a lot of space in here. You can see different kinds of fibers, right? One of them that you see is this big, thick pink one. And what are the thick pink fibers? Collagen fibers. The other one that you see are these skinny little black ones. And what are those? Elastic fibers. And then you can see all these little purple cells, and those are our fibroblasts. Adipose tissue, this is another type of loose connective tissue. Adipose is also, it's the same thing as fat tissue. This has a really similar matrix to areolar tissue, so it has all 3 fiber types in it. But the cells of adipose tissue, and this tissue looks very different. It's still a loose connective tissue, but what has happened in adipose tissue is normally when you have a cell, you have a plasma membrane, and then it has sort of a centrally located nucleus, right, with organelles in there. Adipose tissue and adipose cells, they have little vesicles in them that contain fat droplets. So normally in a regular cell, an animal cell, you'll have little vesicles that contain waste and other things. But in an adipose cell, its main function is to store fat. So instead of being a little vesicle storing fat, that vesicle pretty much takes up the entire space inside that cell. And the nucleus and all the organelles get squished to the outside. So the cell looks very different under the microscope. And so a lot of times they're still fibroblasts, right? They're still fibrocytes because this is connective tissue proper. But because they look so different, a lot of times we'll call them adipocytes, right? Just indicating that they're the cells of fat tissue. Think of the functions of fat in your body. What does it do? Where do you have fat? Your stomach. Yes, you do. Exactly. Remember, you've got fat, but this is something you looked at in lab on Monday. What is this called? This layer of fat on top of your abdominal organs. The greater omentum. The greater omentum. So you have this layer of fat that sits on top of all of these abdominal organs that's there for protection, for cushioning. Around a lot of your active organs, like around the kidneys and around the heart, you're also going to have some extra fat. So not only is it there for cushion and protection, but a lot of times you'll have it there for energy storage. Okay, so that makes sense to me, right? Because if you eat more calories than you burn throughout the day, you store the extra as fat. So that's truly what fat is. It's energy storage. It also protects against heat loss. So the more fat you have on your body, the more insulated you are, and the less likely you are to get too cold. We find fat pretty much all over the body. You have it in your skin, so you do have, our bottom layer of our skin is nothing but fat tissue, so you have it in your skin. You have it in your abdomen, the breasts, reproductive organs, and around active organs like the kidneys and the heart. Sometimes we'll have, if we look at this picture, most of the time in our body, the type of fat we have is what I'm showing you up here. We call this white adipose tissue. It looks white under the microscope. So this is fat tissue. Now you can see there's all this space out here around the cells, but these cells are big and plump. And what you're looking at is, I'll circle this one. So here's one cell. That white stuff in the middle is a huge droplet of fat in the middle of that cell. And you can see here the nucleus is mushed to the outside. Okay, same thing if we look at this one up here. So you can see it's a big droplet of fat in that cell, and all the organelles like that nucleus are getting mushed to the outside. So they look very different. Now what I just showed you is white adipose tissue. That's what most adults have. But then another type of adipose tissue is called brown adipose tissue, which looks brown under the microscope. And the reason is it has a lot of mitochondria in it. What do mitochondria do? What is their function?
Make ATP.
They make ATP. I always remember my teacher always used to say they're the powerhouse of the cell. And I was always like, what does that mean? I never knew when I was little. But the mitochondria are the powerhouse of the cell. They are making the energy. Okay? So what we find is that in really active tissues that require a lot of energy, you have a lot of mitochondria. So like in muscle, for example. Muscle has a lot of mitochondria in it. How many of you like to eat turkey at Thanksgiving? Really? What do you all eat? Nothing? Ham? Oh, all right. Where's my turkey peeps? I love turkey. How many of you like the white meat, the breast meat? How many of you like the dark meat? So I want you to think about, where does the white meat of a turkey come from? The breast, right? Where does the dark meat come from? The thighs and the legs, the wings. So what you're going to find is that the reason that meat is darker, it's more brown in color, is because those muscles that you're consuming, that's what meat is, it's muscles. I know that's gross to think about. They're more active, so they have more mitochondria, which is why it's darker in color. That's why the meat is brown. When you eat white meat, it's less active. So like the breast of a turkey, not much happening up there. Not a lot of mitochondria, so it's lighter in color. So this is why meat, especially when you're looking at chicken and poultry, sometimes it's darker if it's more active. It's because of the mitochondria. Or lighter, less active, less mitochondria. It's this weird to think about that, isn't that? I just think it's so odd to take what you're eating and put it into this perspective. But you all will probably think of that on Thanksgiving Day, and you can let all of your family members know what they're eating on Thanksgiving Day. There will be more turkey for you, I guarantee it, if you tell them that when they're eating. So what we find with brown adipose tissue, it has a lot more mitochondria in it. And the reason is it burns through the fat. So this is a type of fat tissue that has mitochondria so that it can burn the fat that's in there. So we find this very often in young babies. Babies that are just born do not have the ability to shiver to warm up. Now babies will shiver, but it's just a reflex. It's not anything that's helping to actually warm their body yet. So what we find is that this brown adipose tissue burns really fast in babies, especially newborns, and it helps to heat their body up a little bit. Usually in a baby, where we'll find it is between the shoulder blades, in the back between the shoulder blades. We'll also find it on the anterior lateral neck. So anterior means front, lateral means off to the side, so in here on a baby. And then in the anterior abdominal wall of a baby, you'll find a lot of brown adipose tissue. Most of the time what we find is that brown adipose tissue is gone by mid-adolescence. It's been burned, right? And you've replaced it with white adipose tissue. However, some research has started to suggest that those individuals that stay thin their whole lives, these are the people that can eat whatever they want. And you know, I've known people like that, you know, people that can eat 10 Snicker bars a day and still not gaining any weight. I'm super jealous. But those are the individuals, they've actually found that those people as adults still have brown adipose tissue. So genetically, they are still just burning through their fat really fast because it has more mitochondria in it. So they're the lucky ones. Now another type of connective tissue proper that we have is reticular connective tissue. This one gets its name because it has a lot of reticular fibers in it. So reticular tissue has reticular fibers. Still has fibroblasts because it's still a connective tissue proper. And this is one that is going to form sort of a soft internal skeleton of some of the organs of your body. So the spleen, for example, has a lot of reticular connective tissue in it. It gives it kind of a structure. So here's our reticular connective tissue. You can see it's still loose, it's very spread out, there's a lot of white space. These are our fibers, our reticular fibers, and you can see all those fibroblasts in there. So those are our 3 loose connective tissue propers. We also have a couple of dense connective tissue propers. What do you think of when you hear the word dense? Everything compacted together, right? So dense, regular connective tissue is the first one I want to talk about. This is made of a lot of collagen fibers. Now remember, these are the ones that are stronger than steel. So dense, regular connective tissue, it gets its name because the collagen fibers are regularly arranged, meaning they are parallel with each other. So they're all running in the same direction. That means that it can withstand tension in one direction. So great example, tendons and ligaments. Now, you've got a muscle that has a tendon that's connected to the bone, and when that muscle contracts, it pulls in one direction on that bone. Okay? So it can withstand a lot of tension and a lot of force in that one direction. Again, the major type of cell, we're still connective tissue proper, so it's still going to be that fibroblast. And this is an example, this is a picture of dense, regular connective tissue. Notice the difference. This is dense. See how all the cells and all the fibers are compacted? Let me go back real quick and that's loose. That's loose. Everything's spread out. That's loose. It's spread out. But when you get to a dense connective tissue, it looks dense. Everything is compacted. Here you can see in pink, these are all of our collagen fibers. Right now they might be a little wavy, but they are all right on top of each other. And you can see the fibroblasts kind of squeezed in there. The other type of dense connective tissue is dense irregular connective tissue. This still has a lot of collagen fibers, but in this case they are in a hodgepodge, so they are irregularly arranged. So instead of the collagen fibers being nice and parallel, they run in all different directions. What does that mean for the strength of that tissue? That means that it can withstand tension in many directions. Because now we've got these really tough, thick, stronger than steel collagen fibers, not going in one direction, going in all different directions. So you can pull on this tissue from all different directions and it can withstand that tension. So this is a picture of dense irregular connective tissue. So this is showing you that tissue, and in this case it's kind of arranged in a hodgepodge. You can see all these collagen fibers look like they're all over the place. Still compacted, they're just not nice and parallel anymore. Okay. Here's an example of where you might find this. A joint capsule, so surrounding your joint, it's going to get a lot more wear and tear. It's going to move in more than one direction. Another example is one of the layers of your skin in the dermis. This has dense, irregular connective tissue in it. Because I want you to think about your skin. It is constantly being pulled in different directions. Now this is a really tough tissue, and it can withstand tension, but it isn't foolproof and it can still tear. You know this in your skin, because your skin and this layer in your skin can tear, and you're going to see it on the surface as a stretch mark. What causes stretch marks?
Stretching.
When you get pregnant, when you go through growth spurts really fast, people sometimes will get stretch marks, especially around the joints. Gaining weight too quickly, you get some stretch marks. So if you put too much tension too quickly on the skin, on this tissue in the skin, it's going to tear, and you're going to see it as those silvery stretch marks. Right? But it still can withstand a lot of tension, but sometimes you can overload it. So those are our connective tissue propers. Now we also have cartilage. And cartilage is sort of in between connective tissue proper and bone. So it's not quite as tough as bone. It still has some flexibility like connective tissue proper. Your cartilage does not have nerves and it does not have a blood supply. So usually, if someone damages their cartilage, especially like in the knee joint, for example, you've got some cartilage down in here. You have no nerve fibers in that cartilage, so if you damage your cartilage, your knee hurts. But it's not because of the cartilage itself. It's because now when you start to bend that knee, it rubs on that damaged cartilage, and you do have nerves in your bones. So your bones are feeling it. And that's why it's usually pretty painful. But it has no nerves and it does not have a blood supply. Your cartilage gets its nutrients by diffusion from surrounding tissues. And cartilage has a huge amount of tissue fluid. This is super important because this is going to help it hold water, which means that it'll rebound after compression. Right? And if we think about where we find cartilage, you're going to find it at the ends of all of your bones. A lot of times we'll find cartilage pads kind of padding the surfaces of two bones. So you want it to be able to be compressed and rebound. Type of cells in our cartilage are chondroblasts and chondrocytes. And that term chondra just means cartilage. The blasts are the immature cells. They're making the cartilage. And the cytes, these are the mature cells. Now something that's different whenever you're looking at a tissue like cartilage or bone, because these are so hard, what happens is when a chondroblast build the cartilage, what they do is, I always think of it as like mopping yourself into the corner, when you're cleaning the floor. So it's like the chondroblast is building the cartilage, and it's putting this new matrix all around itself, and then eventually it goes, oh crap, and it's now stuck in a hole. That hole is called a lacuna. Once it's stuck in the lacuna, we now call it a chondrocyte. So that little cavity is called a lacuna. Think of it as like a laguna. So the first type of cartilage that I want to mention is hyaline cartilage. Hyaline cartilage has a lot of collagen fibers in it. Again, these are stronger than steel, but we don't see them. They are so close together and so compacted together that they kind of blend together. So it actually gives hyaline cartilage, when you look at it under the microscope, a very glassy appearance in the background. It looks really pretty. It's one of my favorites to look at. And so this is actually how it gets its name, hyaline, because hyaline literally means glassy. So that's how it gets its name. And the cells are chondrocytes. Again, if we're looking at a hard tissue like cartilage or bone, that chondrocyte is found in a lacuna. This is the most abundant cartilage that we have in the body because it is very firm, but it still is slightly pliable. A lot of times we'll have it all over the body, helping to reduce friction and absorb some shock. So for example, at the ends of every bone in the body, you have hyaline cartilage. We also find hyaline cartilage in the embryo. It is, sometimes we call it the pre-skeleton. So in an embryo, it will form this sort of hyaline cartilage pre-skeleton that is a placeholder for the bones that will come in and form within that cartilage. So this is showing you here, this is another place we have hyaline cartilage in our costal cartilage, connecting our ribs to our sternum. And this is what it looks like under the microscope. So you can see the background is nice and pretty and glassy. It usually has this sort of iridescent purple color to it. And you can also see the chondrocytes in lacuna. Okay, so you can see them sitting in those holes. Elastic cartilage is very similar, but it has way more elastic fibers. So those stretchy fibers. You still have chondrocytes in lacuna, again, because it's a tough tissue. And we're going to find this anywhere where we need a lot of strength, but a little flexibility. Okay, so like in the ear, we call that the pinna. And then also in the epiglottis. Does anybody know what the epiglottis is? Where do we find it? Your epiglottis is a little flap that you have that's found in the back of your throat, and it closes over your trachea, your windpipe, when you swallow food. So in the back of your throat, you actually have two tubes coming up to the back of your throat. You have the esophagus. What goes down the esophagus? Food to the stomach. And then you also have your trachea, and your trachea is taking air to the lungs. So they're both in the back of the throat. The last thing you want is food to go down the wrong pipe. That's what my mom calls it. And so you have, covering your trachea, you have an epiglottis. So every time you swallow, your trachea gets covered by this elastic cartilage flap to make sure that food goes down the esophagus and into your stomach, and make sure that you don't aspirate your food, right? Sometimes, you know, if you take a drink of water and you're trying to talk at the same time, or someone makes you laugh, it'll start to make you cough. That's what my mom calls it, going down the wrong pipe. And what's happened is anytime food or liquid gets down into the top of the trachea, it immediately triggers that coughing reflex. You're going to cough until you get it out, okay? It's only a problem if you can't keep coughing. That means it was too big and it's lodged in the trachea. And what would we do in that case? We would choke, and someone would have to do the Heimlich maneuver to force that out. This is why you can't swallow and breathe in at the same time. So if you just sit here and try to swallow some spit, try to breathe in while you're doing that. You can't do it. Because your esophagus is closed. Y'all tried, didn't you? So this is an image of elastic cartilage. And this one you can see all the black fibers, which again, remember the black fibers are the elastic fibers. And then you can see those chondrocytes in lacuna, in those spaces. And then the last cartilage I'll mention is fibrocartilage. Fibrocartilage has really thick collagen fibers. Now, if y'all remember when I mentioned our different fibers, I said collagen fibers are usually thick and pink. They usually stain pink. This is the one exception to that. These will stain blue. At least the ones that we look at in lab do. And again, the cell is a chondrocyte and a lacuna. We're going to find this because it's got collagen fibers anywhere where we need a lot of support and we need the ability to withstand heavy pressure. So examples are going to be in the meniscus of the knee. That's going to be fibrocartilage. The intervertebral discs between your vertebrae, that's going to be fibrocartilage. Anywhere where you have a tremendous amount of pressure. This area right here, this is called our pubic symphysis. It's where two pelvic bones come together. That's fibrocartilage. You got a lot of pressure. It's holding up your entire body. So this is fibrocartilage under the microscope, and you can see all those blue collagen fibers. And then you can also see all the chondrocytes in those holes, in those lacuna. We also have, so we've done connective tissue proper, we've done our cartilage, now we have bone. Bone is the fibers in bone are collagen fibers, and it has a really hard matrix. It's a calcified matrix. And bone has not just calcium in it, but calcium salts, and it's the calcium salts that are going to make it really hard. The type of cell are osteocytes. Again, anytime it's a hard tissue like cartilage or bone, the sites are always found in lacuna. So it's an osteocyte found in a lacuna. One of the things I want to mention, so you can spell lacuna this way, this with just an A at the end. This is the singular version. Okay, that's if we're just talking about one lacuna. Lacunae, you add an E at the end, that's the plural version. So that means if you're talking about more than one. You're going to see that a lot in lab. So anytime we're looking at something that ends in A to make it plural, you usually add an E to the end. Okay? So a lot of times students will ask me, well, do I spell it with an A or an AE? Depends on if you're talking about one or two or more than one. Bone has a fabulous blood supply, right? We mentioned this already. It is very supportive. It gives your body a framework. Without bones, we'd be a puddle of skin and goo on the floor. So it gives us a framework. It is very protective. It protects a lot of our vital organs. It also provides levers for your muscles to function. It stores calcium, minerals, and fat, right? So it stores calcium. And this is something that I think we mentioned. Calcium helps to make our bones hard, right? So when we store calcium in our bones, it makes them hard. But what do we need calcium for? Cell division? Everything. Cell division, muscle contraction, for nerves to fire, for glands to secrete. You need it for a blood to clot. You need it for everything. So your body is always regulating your blood calcium level, and if you have extra, you store it in your bones, and it makes your bones nice and hard. Now we also store red bone marrow inside our bones, and this is where the site of hematopoiesis. We'll talk a lot more about that in AP2, but hematopoiesis is just the term for blood cell formation. So you actually make your blood from your red bone marrow, which is stored inside of your bones because your bones are hollow. This is what bone looks like under the microscope. This one should be one of the easiest to identify. It looks like tree rings under the microscope. So one of the things I'm going to point out is you can see like this one. This looks like one big tree ring. We call that part right in the middle. That is not the nucleus. That's something that's called the central canal. You can see one over here too. You can see them all over. This one is just empty. The central canal carries nerves and blood vessels. So this is looking at bone under a microscope, and you can already see there's all these little central canals. So that should tell you how well vascular bone is. It has a fabulous blood supply. These little teeny tiny dots that go all the way around the central canal, those are the osteocytes in lacuna. Okay. And then our last connective tissue is blood. Again, this is one of the most atypical connective tissue. Again, it doesn't really give support. Your book says it doesn't connect or give support. I'm going to argue that because it does connect things together. right? Your blood connects everything in your body together. So I argued that a little bit. But it definitely doesn't give any support. But the reason we classify it as a connective tissue is because it does develop from that mesenchyme, from that embryonic tissue. We're going to do the same thing we've done with all of our connective tissues, where I tell you the type of fiber and the cells in there. But again, it's atypical, so it doesn't really fit the rest of the rules. Fibers. Blood does have fibers in it, you just can't see them. They are typically soluble fibers. The only time you see them is when your blood is clotting, and then you'll see the fibers. But otherwise, you don't typically see them. The type of cells in your blood are red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. And they're in the blood plasma, in that fluid matrix. Your blood is always housed within your blood vessels. And the functions of your blood is to transport gases like oxygen and CO2. It transports nutrients and wastes. And it also transports hormones throughout your body. Blood, I think, along with bone, is also a really easy tissue to identify under the microscope. You can identify, you can see this liquid stuff in the back. That's just our blood plasma. That's the liquid part of blood. All of these small pink cells, those are our red blood cells. And the big ones, with the big nuclei, those are our white blood cells. Okay? And then these little things like this, looks like debris, those are our platelets that help our blood clot. This is the table that you have. So remember that purple and pink one with the arrows, and I said this is a really good one to study connective tissues with. This is the updated version of that chart that you have in your book. This one is fine too. I just like the arrows. I don't know why. It's the same thing, just visually looks a little different. So if you have your book and you want to study connective tissues with this chart, that's fine. It's showing you your connective tissue propers, all the different ones, tells you some of the general features. Same thing with our cartilage, tells you the 3 types of cartilage and their features. Talks about bone, talks about blood. Okay, so it's a great study tool. Now the last 2 tissues that we have, all right, so we've done epithelial and connective tissue. We also have nervous tissue. And nervous tissue is going to make up the brain and spinal cord and all the nerves that you have in your body. And the function of nervous tissue is that it can sense and respond to a stimulus. And there's 2 main types of cells in your nervous tissue. There are the ones that send signals. Those are called neurons. So these can generate and conduct an impulse and send signals through your body. So they're going to sense something's going on. They're going to respond to that, and they can send those signals. The other type are called neuroglia. We can also sometimes call those supporting cells. Neuroglia do not send signals. They do not conduct. They are not sending any kind of signal. Their only function is to support neurons. So they support neurons. They make sure that there's a blood supply close to neurons, because neurons have a high metabolic rate. They need nutrients. They make sure that neurons stay healthy. If there's any debris in the area, neuroglia will clean it up. They insulate neurons and make sure that they're nice and insulated. So these have a really important function. They're just not sending signals. Their function is so important that they make up half the mass of your brain. So half the mass of your brain is neurons, which are sending signals. The other half is neuroglia, which aren't sending any signals at all. They're just supporting the neurons that are there. So this is a picture of nervous tissue, and this one also, just like bone and just like blood, this one's really easy to identify. It looks like kind of like smushed bugs with these long like tentacles coming off of it. These are our big neurons, and you can see they have these long branching processes so they can send signals. These little tiny dots that you see all over in the background, those are our neuroglia. Those are the ones that are supporting the neurons. And then our last tissue that we'll mention today, so I'll get to our 4th one, is muscle tissue. And we have 3 kinds of muscle. We have skeletal, we have cardiac, and smooth. Okay, So those are our three types: skeletal, cardiac, and smooth. Skeletal muscle is attached to our skeleton. Where do we find our cardiac muscle? Yeah, in our heart. And how about smooth muscle? Where do we find that one? I heard somebody say inside. Inside our hollow organs. Okay, so those are our three types. We'll start with skeletal muscle. Skeletal muscle, the cells of skeletal muscle, instead of being round cells, they are super long cells. So they look like this. Usually they'll run off the field of view of the microscope slide. They're so long. They can be up to 1 meter in length. They are multinucleated, so they have many nuclei in them. Usually the nuclei are kind of mushed towards the outside. They also have these obvious stripes, these little striations. Okay? And the location of our skeletal muscle, again, is it's attached to our skeleton. It's attached to the bones of the body. And the function is basically that it controls voluntary movement. This is the only one of our three muscles that is under voluntary control, which means if I want to pick up this remote, I pick up the remote. I have control over all of my skeletal muscles, and I can tell them to do that. So it's under voluntary control. I can control those muscles. This is what it looks like under the microscope. So this is looking at the tricep muscle. And you can see you've got all these long cells. So like this is one cell down here. You can see it's so long it runs off the field of view of the scope. You can see all these dark nuclei mushed to the outside, and you can see those striations in it. Now cardiac muscle is a little different. This is something that we find in the heart. The muscle cells have some branching in them. So they're still long, but they have a little bit of branching that takes place. Okay? They are uninucleate, so it means that for this one big cell, there's only going to be one nucleus. They also have something called intercalated discs. And that's where you have this big, sharp line that you'll notice within that cell. It's pretty easy to identify. The function of the intercalated disc is so that one muscle cell and the adjacent muscle cell can communicate with each other, and they can contract in unison. That's super important for your heart because you want your heart to contract in unison. Okay, so intercalated discs are letting that happen. The function, obviously, since it's making up the heart, is it's going to help to propel blood through your blood vessels. But this one, unlike skeletal muscle, is involuntary. You do not have control of your heart and the contractions of your heart. Thank goodness, because I'm pretty sure I would forget on a regular basis to make my heart contract. So we don't have to think about it. It just happens. But this is showing you, again, you can kind of see it's still long, but you can see all the branches. And here, these dark bands, those are our intercalated discs. So those should be pretty easy to identify. And that's the identifying thing for cardiac muscle. That's how you know it's cardiac muscle. And then our last muscle is smooth muscle. Smooth muscle gets its name because it has no striations. So it looks really smooth. The cells also look very different. They're not these sort of long cells. Instead, they're sort of spindle-shaped, like this, with a central nucleus, so kind of like an eye. And we find these in the walls of our hollow organs, helping to push things and propel things through. So we'll find them in the digestive tract, pushing food through. We'll find them also in our blood vessels, helping to squeeze blood through our blood vessels. So it just helps to propel substances. That term, peristalsis, is the term we use to describe the propulsion of substances in the internal body. That's peristalsis. And this one is also involuntary. You know, again, you ate your Lucky Charms this morning and you don't think about them again until they come out the other end. It's getting propelled through your body by smooth muscle. So here is some smooth muscle. This is not the best picture from your book. I think it looks super blurry. But we can kind of pull out some of the cells and you can see that they're nice and spindle-shaped cells. And you also can tell there are no striations in there anywhere. Okay. Anybody have questions on our 4 different types of tissues that we have in the body? Because what we'll do in lab when we get there is we're going to end up setting out about 18 different microscopes and looking at all these tissues so that you can identify them under the microscope. So not only for lecture do you need to know these characteristics of all these tissues, but in lab you need to be able to identify them under scope. Now on a lecture exam, I am never on a lecture exam going to put a blurry black and white photo like this and say what kind of tissue is this, right? That's not what lecture exam is for. Your lecture exam is going to be multiple choice, and I'll ask you about some distinguishing characteristics about the tissue. There will not be pictures. A lot of students freak out thinking they're going to have to identify pictures. You have to identify the tissue in lab under the microscope. So you're actually going to look at it under the scope, and for your lab exam, you've got to be able to identify it, but not for a lecture exam. Okay? So the last couple things that I want to mention are a little bit about membranes. So the membranes that we have in our body usually contain at least 2 types of tissues. So 2 of the tissues that we've talked about. And there's 3 membranes I want to just cover with you. The cutaneous membrane, which is your skin, right? The term cutaneous just means skin. And that's actually the next chapter that we'll cover. Your mucous membranes, which are just moist membranes. Usually these are membranes that you find lining an open body cavity, like the urogenital tract or the digestive tract. Your mouth is a moist mucous membrane. And then lastly are our serous membranes, and these are found in closed body cavities. So this would be like our thoracic cavity, or we might find them in the abdominal pelvic cavity. So these are in our body cavities. So the first one, our cutaneous membrane, like the skin, this has 2 tissues. The outer tissue is a stratified squamous epithelial tissue. What is the function of that tissue? Protection. That makes sense to me. All right, it's your skin. The outermost layer is going to be there for protection. Underneath that is dense, irregular connective tissue. This is the one where the collagen fibers are arranged in a hodgepodge, so it can withstand tension from lots of different directions. So those are the 2 layers that we have making up our cutaneous membrane. Stratified squamous epithelium and dense irregular connective tissue. They both make sense if we think about their function. Mucous membranes, these are our moist membranes that usually are lining an open body cavity. Sometimes we call these mucosa. Again, you'll notice there's an E at the end of that, so it's plural. So our digestive tract, so our mouth, our respiratory tract, so the nose and the trachea, the urogenital tracts, those are all moist mucous membranes. And the 2 tissues are stratified squamous epithelium. What's the function of that? Makes sense. It is an opening to the inside of your body. You want a stratified epithelium in those areas, right, to protect from abrasion and wear and tear. And then under that is a loose connective tissue. Usually it's, I didn't spell that right. Usually it's areolar. Which has a lot of fibroblasts, but also macrophages, mast cells, and white blood cells. So what is the function of that? Immunity. Makes sense. You've got an open body cavity going into your body, and you want to have it not only protective, but protect you from infection. So you want a type of loose connective tissue that provides you with that immunity. And then the last one is our serous membranes, or sometimes we call these serosa. These are our membranes that are found in our closed body cavities. And there's two tissues in our serous membranes, and this is something we looked at in lab or talked about in lab on Monday. There's a simple squamous epithelium. What's the function of all simple epithelium? Absorption, secretion, filtration. So that's the function that we find here. Absorption, secretion, filtration, but also reduces friction. And then a loose connective tissue. Again, this is one that's going to have a lot of white blood cells in it, macrophages and mast cells. So it's there for protection, for immunity. So there's two types, remember, of serous membranes. There's the parietal serosa. The term parietal means that it lines the cavity. And there's the visceral serosa, which always means it lines the organ that's sitting in the cavity. And then we give it a second name that tells you where it's located. So for example, if it's the parietal pleura, where's the pleura? Where would those be found? Lungs. Right, so that would be the cavity that the lungs sit in. If it's the visceral pleura, it means it sits right on top of the lungs. The pericardium, where is that? The heart. So the parietal pericardium lines the cavity that the heart sits in. The visceral pericardium lines the heart itself, reduces friction. And lastly is the peritoneum, which is the abdominopelvic cavity. So the parietal peritoneum means it lines the cavity. The visceral peritoneum means it sits on all the organs in and on top of this abdominopelvic cavity. Right? So this is just showing you where those cavities are, which again we looked at on Monday. All right, so we'll pick up with tissue repair on Wednesday, and then we'll start in chapter 5. So make sure you bring your chapter 5 notes on Wednesday. Y'all have a wonderful holiday weekend and be safe.